The leather belt hissed through the air as Catherine's father advanced toward her, his bloodshot eyes promising the same brutal punishment that had left scars both visible and hidden across her body for years. When the tall cowboy's hand shot out, shattering the worn leather between calloused fingers before it could strike her flesh, Catherine realized in that breathless moment that her life would never be the same again. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet of Willow Creek. Catherine Miller flinched as another crash echoed through their small farmhouse, followed by her father's drunken curses. She kept her head down, fingers trembling as she tried to finish breakfast before his rage found a new target. The bruises from last week had barely faded. "Girl, where's my whiskey?" Thomas Miller's voice boomed from the parlor, slurred but no less terrifying for it. "We don't have any left, Father," Catherine answered, trying to keep her voice steady. At 22, she had spent years perfecting the careful dance of placating her father's volatile temper. Ever since her mother's death 5 years ago, he'd spiraled deeper into the bottle, dragging their once respectable homestead down with him. Heavy footsteps approached the kitchen. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly set a plate of eggs on the table. Thomas Miller filled the doorway, his imposing frame stooped by years of drinking, gray beard unkempt, and eyes bloodshot from last night's bender. "What do you mean there's none left?" he growled, scanning the kitchen with suspicious eyes. "You finished it yesterday, Father. The new shipment won't arrive until—" "Don't lie to me, girl." His fist came down on the table, sending the plate clattering to the floor. "You've hidden it, haven't you, trying to control me in my own house?" Catherine backed away, knowing what came next. "No, Father, I wouldn't." "Your mother tried the same tricks," he snarled, advancing toward her, "always thinking she knew what was best for me." The mention of her mother sent a flash of anger through Catherine, momentarily overriding her fear. "Mother only ever tried to help you," she said, immediately regretting the words as his expression darkened. Thomas's hand went to his belt, the worn leather making a sinister hissing sound as he pulled it from the loops. "You need reminding of your place, girl." Catherine pressed her back against the wall, eyes darting toward the door. There was nowhere to run. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away across open country. No one to hear, no one to help. "Please, Father," she whispered, raising her hands in supplication. The first strike never came. Instead, a sharp knock at the door froze them both. "Miller, you in there?" A deep voice called from outside, followed by more knocking. Thomas cursed, lowering the belt. "What now?" He stormed toward the front door, yanking it open with enough force to rattle the hinges. Catherine followed cautiously, keeping her distance. On their porch stood Jackson Wade, the new ranch hand from the Blackwood property that bordered their land to the west. Tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially shadowed by his hat, he cut an imposing figure despite his youth. At 28, he'd only been in Willow Creek for 6 months, but his reputation as a skilled horseman and hard worker had spread quickly. "Morning, Mr. Miller," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. His eyes flicked briefly to Catherine behind her father, noting her trembling hands and the fear etched across her face. "Mr. Blackwood sent me to discuss the water rights for the North Creek. Says there's been some confusion about the boundary." Thomas scoffed. "There's no confusion. That creek's been on Miller land for 30 years. "Perhaps we could review the documents together," Jackson suggested, not moving from his position. "Mr. Blackwood is willing to come to a fair arrangement." Catherine watched as her father's shoulders tensed. The Blackwood Ranch was the largest in the county, and they'd been trying to buy the Miller property for years. What had once been a prosperous homestead under her grandfather's care was now falling into disrepair, the fields untended and the cattle few. "I ain't selling to Blackwood," Thomas growled. "Not now, not ever." Jackson nodded as though expecting this response. "Nobody's asking you to sell, sir. Just to clarify the water rights." His gaze shifted to Catherine again, lingering this time. "Morning, Miss Miller." She managed a small nod, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance and the fear that must be plainly visible on her face. She'd seen Jackson Wade at church socials and in town, always polite but distant. They'd exchanged few words beyond basic pleasantries. Thomas noticed the exchange and moved to block his view of Catherine. "My daughter's not your concern, Wade. You tell Blackwood I'll be in town tomorrow to sort this out proper." "Yes, sir," Jackson said, but made no move to leave. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, revealing the gun holstered at his hip. Not threatening, but present. "Everything all right in here?" Heard some commotion riding up. "What happens in my house is my business," Thomas snapped, his hand tightening around the belt still clutched in his fist. "Now get off my property." Jackson's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening as they fixed on the belt. For a moment, Catherine thought he might challenge her father directly. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat and said, "Yes, sir. Miss Miller, good day to you." As Jackson turned to leave, Catherine felt a familiar despair settle over her. Another potential ally retreating, unwilling to interfere in what everyone in town knew but no one acknowledged, Thomas Miller's cruelty to his only daughter. But Jackson Wade didn't mount his horse. Instead, he paused at the bottom of the porch steps and looked back. His eyes met Catherine's directly this time, a silent message passing between them. "I see you, I know, and I'll be back." Thomas slammed the door shut, plunging the house back into shadow. He turned to Catherine, rage rekindled by the interruption. "Think you're special now? Got men riding all this way just to tip their hats to you?" "No, Father," she whispered, eyes lowered. But inside, something small and fragile flickered to life. The look in Jackson Wade's eyes had awakened a dangerous feeling she'd long suppressed. Hope. What neither of them knew was that Jackson Wade hadn't come about water rights at all. He had heard the rumors in town, seen the bruises Catherine tried to hide, and made a decision that morning that would change both their lives forever. He would be back, and next time, he wouldn't leave without her. 3 days passed before Jackson Wade returned to the Miller farm. 3 days during which Catherine's world grew darker. After the Cowboy's visit, her father had been especially cruel, as though punishing her for the interruption, for the perceived humiliation of having their private business nearly exposed to an outsider. Catherine winced as she drew water from the well, the simple motion pulling at the fresh welts across her back. The morning air was cool against her skin, the sun not yet high enough to burn away the dawn mist that clung to the fields. In the distance, she could see the silhouette of the Blackwood Ranch's main house, imposing even at this distance. She wondered what it would be like to live somewhere so grand, somewhere safe. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled her from her reverie. She straightened, one hand going to the loose strands of golden hair that had escaped her braid, the other clutching the water bucket like a shield. As the rider emerged from the morning haze, her heart leapt with recognition. Jackson Wade rode tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the sunrise. He wasn't alone this time. Behind him rode Sean Blackwood himself, owner of the neighboring ranch and one of the most powerful men in the county. The older man's silver beard and weathered face gave him a patriarchal air, though his eyes held a kindness that Catherine had always noticed from afar. "Miss Miller," Jackson called, touching the brim of his hat as they approached. His eyes swept over her, noting how she held herself stiffly, how she avoided certain movements. His jaw tightened. "Mr. Wade, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, nodding respectfully. "My father isn't awake yet." Sean Blackwood dismounted with the ease of a man who'd spent his life on horseback, despite being well into his 60s. "That's just as well, Miss Miller. We'd like a word with you first, if you don't mind." Catherine hesitated, glancing toward the house. Her father usually slept until mid-morning after a night of drinking, but if he woke and found her speaking with the Blackwoods... "It won't take long," Jackson said softly, reading her concern. He dismounted and took a step toward her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "Catherine, we need to talk about your situation." The use of her first name startled her. In the small, proper community of Willow Creek, such familiarity between unmarried men and women was frowned upon. Yet there was nothing improper in Jackson's tone, only urgency and concern. "I don't know what you mean," she said automatically, the denial coming as naturally as breathing after years of hiding the truth. Sean Blackwood sighed, his weathered face creasing with compassion. "Child, the whole town knows what your father does. They've known for years and done nothing. I'm ashamed to say I've been among them, respecting a man's right to rule his household without interference." He shook his head. "But there are limits to what can be tolerated in a civilized community." Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes, quickly blinked away. To have her secret spoken of so plainly, acknowledged after years of silence, was both terrifying and strangely liberating. "Mr. Blackwood is offering you a position at his ranch," Jackson continued, his voice low and urgent. "As a housekeeper, with your own quarters in the main house, you'd be safe there." "And what about my father?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'd have no claim on you there," Sean assured her. "My wife has been wanting help since our daughters married and moved east. You'd be doing us a service, Miss Miller." It was a generous offer, more than generous, it was salvation. Yet Catherine hesitated, years of conditioning making her fearful of her father's reaction. He would never allow it. "He doesn't have to," Jackson said firmly. "You're of age. The law says you're free to go where you please." "The law," Catherine echoed with a bitter smile. "The law hasn't concerned itself much with what happens to me before now." Jackson stepped closer. "It will today. I've spoken to Sheriff Barnes. He'll be riding out later to discuss some complaints about your father's behavior in town last weekend." His eyes held hers steadily. "This is your chance, Catherine. You don't have to live like this anymore." The possibility of escape, so sudden and unexpected, overwhelmed her. She'd dreamed of leaving for years, saving what little money she could, planning routes out of Willow Creek. But she'd never imagined help would come like this, openly in the light of day, with the backing of someone as influential as Sean Blackwood. "I couldn't impose," she began, but Sean cut her off with a gentle wave. "It's no imposition. Jackson has been quite insistent about your character and capabilities." The older man's eyes twinkled briefly. "In fact, I don't think I've ever seen him so determined about anything since he came to work for me." A flush crept up Jackson's neck, but he didn't look away from Catherine. "You deserve better," he said simply. The creak of the farmhouse door shattered the moment. Thomas Miller stood on the porch, suspenders hanging loose around his waist, face contorted with rage as he took in the scene before him. "What the hell is this?" he roared, stumbling down the steps. "Blackwood, you trying to steal my land while I sleep?" Sean straightened, facing the angry man with calm dignity. "Nothing of the sort, Thomas. We've come to speak with you about your daughter." "My daughter?" Thomas spat, his bloodshot eyes swinging to Catherine. "What lies has she been telling?" "None, sir," Jackson said, stepping subtly between Catherine and her advancing father. "We're here to make a business proposition, that's all." Thomas sneered, closing the distance between them. The stench of stale whiskey hung around him like a cloud. "I know what you're really after, Wade. Seen how you look at her in town." He turned his fury on Catherine. "Been making eyes at my foreman behind my back, have you?" Whoring yourself out for a chance to leave? Catherine flinched as though he'd struck her, shame and anger burning in equal measure. But before she could respond, Jackson's voice cut through the morning air like a whip. "That's enough, Miller. You'll not speak to her that way again." Thomas's hand went to his belt, the same worn leather he'd threatened Catherine with days before. "I'll speak to my daughter however I damn well please, and I'll teach her what happens to girls who forget their place." The air between the men crackled with tension. Catherine found herself rooted to the spot, the water bucket still clutched in her trembling hands as her father yanked his belt free with a threatening snap. Jackson didn't flinch, his tall frame a barrier between her and the advancing danger. "Thomas," Sean Blackwood cautioned, his voice carrying the weight of his position in the community. "Think carefully about what you're doing." But Thomas Miller was beyond reason, weeks of whiskey and years of bitterness driving him forward. "This is my property, Blackwood, my daughter. You and your hired gun got no right to interfere in my affairs." Catherine watched in horror as her father raised the belt, not toward her this time, but toward Jackson. What happened next occurred so quickly she barely had time to gasp. Jackson's hand shot out, catching the belt mid-swing. With one powerful motion, he wrenched it from her father's grasp. The worn leather, witness to so many of Catherine's tears, dangled from his fist for one breathless moment before Jackson's fingers tightened. The leather cracked, then split clean through as Jackson tore the belt in half with a strength born of righteous anger. "No more," Jackson said, his voice deceptively quiet as he dropped the ruined pieces to the dirt. "You won't hurt her again." Thomas staggered back, momentarily shocked by the display of raw strength. Then his face contorted with fresh rage as he lunged forward with a roar, fists swinging wildly. Jackson sidestepped the clumsy attack with the practiced ease of a man who'd weathered his share of barroom brawls. As Thomas stumbled past, Jackson's hand closed around the older man's collar, using Thomas's own momentum to spin him around and drop him to his knees. "Stay down, Miller," Jackson warned, still keeping his body between the fallen man and Catherine. "Don't make this worse than it already is." "You can't take her," Thomas snarled, spittle flying from his lips as he struggled against Jackson's firm grip. "She's mine until she's married off, and no man in this county would have her once they know she's run off with you." Catherine flinched at the cruel words, knowing the truth in them despite their cruelty. A woman's reputation was fragile in Willow Creek. Once lost, it could never truly be regained. Sean Blackwood stepped forward then, his bearing commanding respect even from a man as far gone as Thomas Miller. "That's why my wife will be chaperoning Miss Miller at our ranch, and why Sheriff Barnes is already on his way to formalize the arrangement." His voice hardened. "The girl has bruises, Thomas, bruises that Dr. Wilson has documented on no fewer than 3 occasions this past year alone." Catherine's eyes widened in surprise. She'd only visited the town doctor when her injuries were too severe to treat herself, making excuses about falls from horses and accidents with kitchen knives. She'd never imagined he'd kept records, never dared hope anyone was quietly building a case for her. "Lies," Thomas spat, though uncertainty flickered across his bloodshot eyes. "The law's changing, Miller," Sean continued. "A father's authority doesn't extend to brutality anymore, not even out here on the frontier." While they spoke, Jackson slowly loosened his hold on Thomas, judging the immediate danger had passed. Catherine watched her father's shoulders slump as the fight gradually drained from him, replaced by the sullen defiance she knew all too well. "Take her, then," he muttered, avoiding everyone's eyes. "She's been nothing but a burden since her mother died anyway. Can't cook worth a damn, and too educated for her own good." The dismissal stung, even after years of similar comments. Catherine swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. She wouldn't cry, not now when freedom was finally within reach. Jackson turned to her, his expression softening. "Do you want to gather your things, Catherine?" Such a simple question, yet it carried the weight of real choice. perhaps the first true choice she'd been offered in years. Catherine nodded, setting down the water bucket with hands that suddenly felt steadier. "I won't be long," she promised, straightening her shoulders as she walked toward the house, giving her father a wide berth. Inside, the small room she'd called her own for 22 years looked suddenly alien, its familiar confines now a reminder of confinement rather than comfort. Catherine moved quickly, pulling her mother's old carpet bag from beneath the bed and filling it with her meager possessions. 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a nightgown, her mother's hairbrush, a small Bible, and the dog-eared copy of Pride and Prejudice that Mrs. Wilson, the doctor's wife, had given her for her 18th birthday. From beneath a loose floorboard, she retrieved a small cloth pouch containing the few coins she'd managed to save over the years. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned from selling eggs and occasionally mending clothes for families in town. As she changed into her Sunday dress, the nicest she owned, Catherine caught her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman who stared back seemed different somehow. Still the same golden hair and clear blue eyes, the same features that her mother had once called too pretty for your own good in a place like this. But there was something new in her expression, a spark of determination, of hope. A gentle knock at the door frame made her turn. Jackson stood there, respectfully keeping to the threshold of her room. "Your father's gone to the barn," he said quietly. "Mr. Blackwood convinced him it would be better if he wasn't here when the sheriff arrives." Catherine nodded, grateful for the small mercy. Despite everything, the thought of her father being arrested or publicly humiliated brought her a complicated pain she wasn't ready to examine. "I'm ready," she said, clutching the carpet bag to her chest like a shield. Jackson's eyes swept over her changed appearance, a flicker of something warm passing through them before he nodded and stepped back. "Mr. Blackwood's waiting outside. We'll ride to the ranch together." As Catherine followed him through the house that had been her prison for so long, a question that had been burning in her mind finally found voice. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Wade? Why risk your position, your reputation for me?" Jackson paused at the front door, turning to face her fully. In the half-light of the cramped hallway, his features softened with an emotion Catherine couldn't quite name. "Because some things are worth fighting for, Catherine," he said simply. "Some people are worth saving." Outside, the morning sun had risen fully, bathing the neglected farmyard in golden light. Sean Blackwood waited with the horses, his expression approving as Catherine emerged from the house in her best dress, her small bag of possessions clutched tightly. For the first time in years, Catherine Miller walked away from her father's house with her head held high, toward a future suddenly filled with possibility. The Blackwood Ranch emerged from the rolling hills like something from the storybooks Catherine had secretly cherished as a child. Whitewashed fences lined the long drive leading to a sprawling 2-story house with wide verandas and tall windows that caught the midday sun. Fields of grazing cattle stretched in the distance, while closer to the main house, a large barn and several outbuildings formed a neat courtyard where ranch hands busied themselves with the day's work. Catherine sat stiffly on Jackson's horse, his strong arms encircling her as he guided the animal toward the house. The nearness of him, the steady rise and fall of his chest against her back, the warmth of his breath occasionally stirring her hair, awakened sensations she'd never experienced before. Despite the circumstances, she found herself intensely aware of every point where their bodies connected. "Almost there," Jackson murmured close to her ear, his voice sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. Sean Blackwood had ridden ahead to prepare his wife for Catherine's arrival, and as they approached the house, the front door swung open. Margaret Blackwood stood on the porch, a tall, regal woman with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes that belied the authoritative set of her mouth. Beside her stood a young woman closer to Catherine's age, her resemblance to Mrs. Blackwood marking her as a daughter. Jackson drew his horse to a gentle stop and dismounted with fluid grace before reaching up to help Catherine down. His hands spanned her waist, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all before setting her carefully on her feet. The brief contact left her flustered, unused to such consideration from any man. "Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Blackwood," Jackson greeted with a respectful nod. "This is Miss Catherine Miller." "Welcome to our home, child," Margaret Blackwood said, stepping forward to take Catherine's hands in a warm grip. "I'm Margaret, and this is my youngest, Rebecca, who's visiting from Denver." Rebecca Blackwood smiled warmly, her assessment of Catherine swift but kind. "Mother's been in need of help since I married and moved east. The house is too large for her to manage alone." Catherine's fingers twisted nervously in her skirts. "I'm very grateful for the opportunity, Mrs. Blackwood. I'll work hard, I promise." "I've no doubt of that," Margaret replied, her gaze taking in Catherine's slender frame and the fading bruise at her temple that her hastily arranged hair hadn't quite covered. Something fierce flashed in the older woman's eyes before she smoothly continued, "Rebecca will show you to your room. I'm sure you'd like to settle in before dinner." Jackson cleared his throat. "Sheriff Barnes should be riding out later today. I'll wait and explain the situation to him." "Very good, Mr. Wade," Margaret nodded. "Please join us for dinner afterward. I believe we have much to discuss." As Jackson led his horse toward the barn, Catherine found herself watching him go, struck by the strange emptiness his absence left beside her. Rebecca's gentle touch on her arm brought her back to the moment. "Come," the young woman said kindly. "You look exhausted." The room they led her to was on the second floor, a corner space with windows facing east and south, allowing sunlight to stream across the polished wooden floor. A four-poster bed with a colorful quilt stood against one wall, beside it a small writing desk and chair. A washstand with a porcelain basin occupied another corner, and a wardrobe large enough to hold 3 times Catherine's meager belongings dominated the third wall. "This is for me?" Catherine asked incredulously, setting her carpetbag on a trunk at the foot of the bed. "Of course," Rebecca smiled. "Mother insisted you have a nice room with good light. She said anyone who's lived in shadow deserves sunshine." Catherine's throat tightened at the unexpected kindness. "It's more than I could have imagined." Rebecca moved to the windows, opening one to let in the fresh spring breeze. "Jackson was quite insistent about bringing you here," she said casually, though her eyes held a knowing gleam. "I've never seen him so worked up about anything. He practically stormed into Father's study 3 days ago, demanding something be done about your situation." Heat crept into Catherine's cheeks. "Mr. Wade has been very kind." "Mr. Wade, is it?" Rebecca laughed softly. "The way he looks at you, I'd have thought you were on more familiar terms." "We barely know each other," Catherine protested, though the words felt somehow dishonest. There was a connection between her and Jackson that defied their limited interactions, something that had sparked the moment he'd stood between her and her father's rage. Rebecca's expression sobered. "Well, you'll have time to remedy that now. Jackson is Father's most trusted man. He practically runs the ranch operations these days." She hesitated, then added more gently, "Father told Mother about your situation. Not everything, but enough. I want you to know that you're safe here, Catherine. No one will hurt you under this roof." The simple statement, spoken with such certainty, broke something inside Catherine. Tears she'd held back for years suddenly welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in silent rivers. Rebecca crossed the room without hesitation, wrapping her arms around Catherine's trembling shoulders. "It's all right," she soothed, as Catherine's silent tears turned to wrenching sobs. "You're allowed to cry here. You're allowed to heal." For long minutes, Catherine wept in the arms of this woman she barely knew, releasing years of fear and pain as the afternoon sunlight bathed them in its warm glow. When she finally pulled back, embarrassed by the display, Rebecca simply offered her a handkerchief. "Better?" she asked without judgment. Catherine nodded, wiping at her swollen eyes. "I'm sorry, I don't usually—" "Don't apologize for feeling," Rebecca interrupted gently. "Now why don't you rest a while before dinner? Mother's insistent on proper manners at the table, but she's also ordered your favorite foods." Catherine blinked in confusion. "My favorites?" "Jackson may have mentioned your preference for apple tarts," Rebecca smiled, moving toward the door. "He seems to notice quite a lot about you, Miss Miller." After Rebecca left, Catherine stood alone in the sunlit room, feeling oddly untethered. For as long as she could remember, her days had been structured by her father's demands and moods, by the necessity of survival. Now, with freedom suddenly thrust upon her, she hardly knew what to do with herself. She moved to the washstand, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin to wash her tear-stained face. As she raised her eyes to the small mirror hanging above it, she was startled by the woman who gazed back, still herself, but somehow different. The fear that had shadowed her expression for years had receded, replaced by something tentative yet unmistakable. Hope. And perhaps, if she dared admit it, the first stirrings of something else whenever she thought of Jackson Wade's steady gaze. A knock at the door startled her from her reflection. She opened it to find a young maid with fresh towels and a pitcher of hot water. "Mrs. Blackwood thought you might like to freshen up properly before dinner, miss," the girl said cheerfully. "She also sent this—" She held out a simple but beautiful blue dress. "She said it might fit you better than Miss Rebecca's things, being that you're a bit smaller." Another kindness, another moment of consideration that threatened to overwhelm Catherine's fragile composure. "Thank you," she managed. "Please tell Mrs. Blackwood I'm very grateful." As she bathed and changed into the borrowed dress, Catherine couldn't help wondering what Jackson would think when he saw her at dinner. The thought made her cheeks warm again, a reaction she wasn't entirely familiar with but found she didn't mind. Dinner at the Blackwood house was unlike anything Catherine had experienced since her mother died. The dining room glowed with lamplight, the long mahogany table set with fine china and crystal that caught and scattered the light. Sean and Margaret Blackwood sat at opposite ends, with Rebecca and Catherine along one side. The place across from Catherine remained empty until Jackson arrived. Looking distinctly uncomfortable in clean clothes, his dark hair still damp from washing. When he entered, his eyes immediately found Catherine, widening slightly at the transformation the blue dress and careful styling of her hair had wrought. The bruises that had marred her face seemed to have faded in the warm light, though they both knew they were still there beneath the surface. "Mr. Wade," Margaret Blackwood acknowledged with a nod. "Please join us." Jackson took his seat across from Catherine, his movements stiff with the formality of the setting. He was a man more at ease on horseback than in a dining room, but he handled himself with quiet dignity that Catherine couldn't help but admire. The meal progressed with polite conversation, carefully steered by Margaret to topics that wouldn't distress Catherine. News from Denver, where Rebecca and her husband lived, developments in the county, the spring cattle drive being planned for the following month. "Catherine," Sean said during a lull, his tone gentle but direct. "Sheriff Barnes came by while you were resting. We've made arrangements for your protection." Catherine set down her fork, her appetite suddenly diminished. "What sort of arrangements?" "A restraining order against your father," Sean replied. "He's not to come within 100 yards of you or this property. The sheriff has also documented your injuries." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Dr. Wilson provided his records as well." "And my father?" Catherine asked quietly. "What happens to him?" Jackson's jaw tightened across the table, but he remained silent, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "He's been warned," Sean said diplomatically. If he violates the order or if there are any further incidents, he'll face arrest and likely imprisonment. Catherine nodded, conflicted emotions churning within her. Despite everything, Thomas Miller was still her father. The thought of him alone in that decaying farmhouse, drinking himself into oblivion, brought her a complicated sorrow. "He'll be fine," Jackson said suddenly, seeming to read her thoughts. "Men like your father always survive." There was something in his tone, a bitterness perhaps, or knowledge born of personal experience, that made Catherine wonder about Jackson's own past. What had shaped this man who had so decisively intervened in her life? "Now then," Margaret interjected smoothly. "Catherine, I thought tomorrow we might review the household duties. Nothing too strenuous at first, of course. You'll need time to recover." "I'm stronger than I look, Mrs. Blackwood," Catherine assured her, "and eager to be useful." "She means the welts on your back need time to heal," Jackson said bluntly, causing Rebecca to gasp and Margaret to shoot him a reproving look. Catherine's cheeks burned with shame, but when she raised her eyes to his, she saw no pity there, only a steady, unwavering support that somehow made the exposure of her secrets bearable. "Forgive my plain speaking," Jackson added, not looking away from Catherine. "But there's no need for pretense here. What happened to you wasn't your fault, and you've nothing to be ashamed of." Sean cleared his throat. Jackson's right, though perhaps lacking in table manners. His tone was gently chiding, but his eyes held approval for his foreman's straightforwardness. "This household stands against cruelty in all its forms. You're safe here, Catherine, and you'll be given time to heal properly." The apple tart that followed the meal was indeed Catherine's favorite, the warm spiced apples and flaky crust bringing back memories of her mother's kitchen before everything had gone so terribly wrong. She savored each bite, aware of Jackson watching her enjoyment with a small, satisfied smile. After dinner, the family retired to the parlor. Rebecca played the piano while Margaret showed Catherine some of the household accounts she would eventually help manage. Sean and Jackson spoke quietly by the fireplace, their discussion occasionally rising enough for Catherine to catch fragments about water rights and boundary disputes, real ones this time, not the pretext Jackson had used to visit the Miller farm. As the clock chimed 9, Jackson rose to take his leave. "I should get back to the bunkhouse," he said, nodding respectfully to the Blackwoods before turning to Catherine. "Miss Miller, might I have a word before I go?" Heart suddenly fluttering beneath her ribs, Catherine followed him onto the veranda. The spring night was cool but not cold, the sky a vast canopy of stars above the darkened ranch. "How are you truly?" Jackson asked when they were alone, his voice losing the formal edge it had carried throughout dinner. "I hardly know," Catherine admitted. "Everything's happened so quickly. This morning I was drawing water from my father's well, and tonight—" She gestured to the grand house behind them. "Do you regret coming?" "No," she said without hesitation. "How could I? You've given me a chance at a real life, Mr. Wade." "Jackson," he corrected softly. "After everything, I think you could call me Jackson, at least when it's just us." Catherine smiled, testing the name on her tongue. "Jackson." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the subtle flecks of green in his hazel eyes, even in the dim light from the parlor windows. "I've wanted to help you for months," he confessed. "Ever since I first saw you in town with that bruise you tried to hide with your shawl. But I didn't know how, not without making things worse for you. Why did you decide to act now?" His expression darkened. "Last Sunday at church, you winced when you sat down in the pew. I knew what that meant. I've seen it before." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "My mother endured the same from my father. No one helped her, and eventually, it killed her." The confession hung between them, heavy with shared understanding. Catherine reached out impulsively, her fingers brushing against his calloused hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just promise me you'll let yourself heal here. Let yourself become the woman you were meant to be, without fear shaping every decision." Their hands had somehow become fully entwined, his large one engulfing her smaller fingers in gentle warmth. The intimacy of the gesture should have frightened her after years of fearing a man's touch, but Jackson's hand felt different. It felt like safety, like promise. "I should go," he said reluctantly, slowly releasing her hand. "People will talk if I linger too long on your first night here." "Let them talk," Catherine surprised herself by saying. "You've earned the right to say a proper good night to me." Something flared in his eyes, surprise, followed by a warmth that sent heat curling through her belly. Slowly, telegraphing his movements as if to give her time to retreat, Jackson raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Catherine," he murmured against her skin. "Sleep well." Catherine's first week at the Blackwood Ranch passed in a blur of new routines and cautious adjustments. True to her word, Margaret Blackwood started her with simple tasks, arranging flowers from the garden, helping with menu planning, and learning the rhythms of the large household. Despite Catherine's protests that she could handle more, the older woman remained firm. "Your body needs time to heal," Margaret said one morning as they walked through the kitchen garden. "And so does your spirit. There's no rush, my dear." Catherine found herself settling into a pattern that felt both strange and wonderful. Breakfast with the family each morning, her days filled with purposeful work that never left her exhausted or afraid, dinners in the warm glow of conversation and laughter. Most surprising was the sleep, deep and untroubled, for the first time in years, without the need to stay alert for her father's drunken rages. She saw Jackson daily, though often at a distance as he went about managing the ranch operations. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the yard or during dinner when he joined the family, and the silent connection between them grew stronger with each passing day. Occasionally, they managed brief private conversations on the veranda or in the garden, moments Catherine found herself anticipating with a flutter of excitement she scarcely recognized. On the morning marking her 8th day at the ranch, Catherine was arranging fresh wildflowers in the parlor when Rebecca entered with a letter in hand. "From town," she explained, holding out the envelope. "Sheriff Barnes brought it himself." Catherine took the letter with trembling fingers, recognizing her father's uneven scrawl immediately. "Thank you," she murmured, tucking it into her pocket unopened. Rebecca studied her with sympathetic eyes. "You don't have to read it, you know." "I know." Catherine resumed her work with the flowers, carefully placing blue lupines among the bright yellow buttercups. "But I will." Later, alone in her room with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, Catherine finally broke the seal on her father's letter. His writing, always difficult to decipher, was worse than usual, the letters slanting wildly across the page. "Catherine, the farm is falling apart without you. The Blackwoods have plenty of help. They don't need you like I do. You've always been dramatic, just like your mother. Whatever grievances you think you have, remember I kept a roof over your head for 22 years. You've made your point. It's time to come home now. I've promised Sheriff Barnes there won't be any more trouble. You belong with your family, not working as a servant for rich folk who'll never see you as their equal. Your father, no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just the same manipulation that had kept her trapped for years." Catherine folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. She had expected to feel something, anger perhaps, or the old fear, but instead found only a hollow sadness for the broken man who had never learned to be a proper father. A knock at her door drew her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Jackson, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "I heard you received a letter," he said by way of explanation. "Sheriff Barnes mentioned it when I was in town this morning." Catherine stepped back to allow him entry, aware that leaving her bedroom door open was the proper thing to do, but somehow unconcerned with propriety in that moment. "It was from my father," she confirmed, gesturing to the desk where the letter lay. "He wants me to come home." Jackson's expression hardened. "And what do you want, Catherine?" The question, so simple yet so profound, caught her off guard. For most of her life, what Catherine wanted had been irrelevant. Survival had been the only priority. "I want to stay here," she said, the words emerging with surprising certainty. "I want to build a life that isn't defined by fear." Jackson nodded, relief visible in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. "Good. That's good." He hesitated, then continued more carefully. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you. The spring cattle drive begins next week. I'll be gone for nearly 3 weeks, leading the herd to the railhead at Cheyenne." Catherine felt an unexpected pang at the thought of him leaving, even temporarily. "I see. Before I go, I'd like your permission to speak with your father." She looked up sharply. "Why would you want to do that?" "To make sure he understands that your decision is final," Jackson explained, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes men like your father need to hear certain things from another man before they'll accept the truth." "And what truth is that?" Jackson took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "That you're under the protection of people who care about you now. That he'll never hurt you again." The intensity in his eyes sent warmth spreading through her chest. "People who care about me," she echoed softly. "Including you. Especially me." The admission seemed to cost him something, a vulnerability showing through his usually composed exterior. "I care more than I should, given how short a time we've known each other." Catherine thought about the past week, about the connection that had formed between them from that first moment he'd stood between her and her father's rage. It wasn't just gratitude she felt when their eyes met across the dinner table, or when his hand accidentally brushed hers while helping her into the buggy for Sunday church. "Time doesn't always measure the truest things," she said, surprising herself with the philosophical turn. "Some people know each other for years and remain strangers. Others recognize something in each other right away." Jackson finished for her, taking another step closer until barely an arm's length separated them. "Something that feels like it was always meant to be." The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken possibilities. Catherine found herself unable to look away from his face, the strong line of his jaw, the earnestness in his eyes, the slight parting of his lips as though there were words still waiting to be said. "Yes," she agreed softly. "You have my permission to speak with my father, but please be careful. He's not a reasonable man when he's been drinking." Jackson nodded, his expression softening. "I won't do anything to make things harder for you, Catherine, I promise." Before either could say more, Rebecca's voice called from downstairs, breaking the moment. Catherine stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they'd been standing, of the impropriety of having him in her room despite the open door. "You should go," she said reluctantly. Jackson reached out slowly, as though giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. "When I return from the cattle drive," he said, his voice low and earnest, "we should continue this conversation. There's much more I'd like to say to you, Catherine Miller." As his fingers gently squeezed hers before releasing them, Catherine felt something unfamiliar and exhilarating unfurl in her chest, a feeling that, in another life, she might have recognized immediately as the first stirrings of love. The Miller farm looked even more dilapidated than Jackson remembered as he rode up the dusty path 2 days later. Weeds had overtaken what was once Catherine's vegetable garden, and several fence posts leaned at precarious angles, their wire hanging loose. The house itself seemed to have aged years in just over a week, its weathered boards groaning in the afternoon breeze. Jackson dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post with deliberate movements that belied the tension coiling inside him. He'd promised Catherine he would be civil, would simply make her father understand that she wouldn't be returning. Yet standing here, where he had witnessed Thomas Miller's cruelty firsthand, Jackson found his resolve tested. He knocked firmly on the door, hearing shuffling movements inside before it swung open. Thomas Miller stood swaying in the doorway, unshaven and bleary-eyed, the stench of whiskey rolling off him in waves. "You," Thomas spat when recognition dawned. "Come to gloat, have you?" "May I come in, Mr. Miller?" Jackson kept his voice level, his hand resting casually near his holster, not threatening but prepared. Thomas laughed bitterly, stepping back with exaggerated courtesy. "By all means. It's not like I can stop you taking whatever you want. You've already taken my daughter." The interior of the house was worse than the outside. Unwashed dishes piled in the kitchen, empty bottles littering the floor, clothes strewn about as though Thomas had been searching for something and given up halfway. "I came to talk about Catherine," Jackson said, remaining standing as Thomas slumped into a chair at the kitchen table. "She got my letter?" "She did." "And?" Thomas's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "She coming home where she belongs?" Jackson met his gaze steadily. "No, sir, she's not, and I wanted to make sure you understand that her decision is final." Thomas snorted, reaching for a half-empty bottle on the table. "She'll be back. Girl's got nowhere else to go. The Blackwoods are just using her for cheap labor." "Catherine is valued there," Jackson countered, his temper rising despite his best efforts. "She's respected. Safe." "Safe," Thomas echoed mockingly, taking a long pull from the bottle. "What would you know about keeping a woman safe? You're just a hired hand." "I know enough not to raise my hand to someone who depends on me," Jackson said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "I know what it means to protect instead of harm." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a flicker of shame quickly buried beneath defensive anger. "You think you know everything, don't you? You have any idea what it's like losing the only woman you ever loved, raising a daughter who looks at you with her mother's eyes every day, reminding you of what you lost? That's no excuse for what you did to her." Thomas slammed the bottle down, liquid sloshing over the rim. "I provided for her, kept a roof over her head when I could barely keep the farm running. You think I don't know I've been a poor excuse for a father? You think I don't see it every time I look in the mirror?" The raw pain in the older man's voice gave Jackson pause. Not because it excused anything, nothing could excuse years of abuse, but because it revealed the broken man beneath the monster Catherine had fled. "Catherine deserves a chance at happiness," Jackson said more gently. "Surely even you can agree with that." Thomas stared into the amber depths of his bottle, shoulders slumping in defeat. "She's really not coming back, is she?" "No." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant lowing of neglected cattle. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Jackson finally said. "Leading the spring drive to Cheyenne. I'll be gone 3 weeks. During that time, I need your word you won't try to contact Catherine or come to the Blackwood Ranch." "Or what?" The challenge lacked real fire, more habit than genuine defiance. "Or Sheriff Barnes will enforce the restraining order, and I'll personally make sure you regret it when I return." Thomas looked up then, studying Jackson with suddenly shrewd eyes despite his drunken state. "You care for her," he observed. "It's not just about protecting Blackwood's interests." Jackson didn't deny it. "Catherine deserves someone who sees her worth, who treats her with kindness." "And you think that's you?" Thomas laughed harshly. A ranch hand with nothing to his name? I think that's for Catherine to decide, Jackson replied evenly. Not you, not me, her. Something like respect flickered across Thomas's face before he looked away. She's stubborn. Gets that from her mother. He sighed heavily. Tell her the farm will still be here, if she ever wants any of her mother's things. It was as close to a concession as Jackson was likely to get. He nodded once and turned to leave, pausing at the door. There's work at the Simmons place if you're interested. Old man Simmons is looking for help with spring planting. Thomas grunted non-committally, but Jackson had said what he came to say. As he mounted his horse and rode away from the Miller farm, he felt a complex mixture of pity and lingering anger toward the broken man in that decaying house. Catherine had escaped, but Thomas Miller remained imprisoned by his own demons. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for starting the cattle drive. Catherine rose early, wanting to see Jackson off, despite the impropriety of a young woman visiting the Cowboys' camp before sunrise. Margaret Blackwood, displaying the pragmatic flexibility that had made her such a successful rancher's wife, simply handed Catherine a basket of freshly baked biscuits. Tell the men these are for their journey, she said with a knowing smile. That way you have a proper reason for being there. The drive camp was already bustling with activity when Catherine arrived. Cowboys moved efficiently among the gathered cattle, checking equipment and making final preparations. Jackson stood at the center of it all, giving instructions and answering questions with the natural authority that made him so valuable to the Blackwoods. He spotted her approaching and immediately broke away, meeting her halfway across the yard. In the soft light of dawn, his face seemed younger somehow, the habitual watchfulness temporarily set aside in his evident pleasure at seeing her. I didn't expect you up so early, he said, taking the basket she offered. I couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye. Catherine was surprised by her own boldness, but didn't regret it. Mrs. Blackwood sent biscuits for the journey. Jackson smiled, setting the basket aside on a nearby wagon. And did she suggest that was a good excuse to come see me off? Catherine blushed. She might have hinted at something of the sort. They stood close, the bustle of the camp creating a strange pocket of privacy around them. Jackson's eyes searched her face as though memorizing it for the long days ahead. I spoke with your father, he said quietly, and he understands you won't be returning. Jackson hesitated. He wanted you to know that if you ever want any of your mother's belongings, the farm will be there. Catherine stood watching until Jackson and the cattle drive disappeared over the distant ridge, a cloud of dust marking their progress long after the men and beasts had vanished from view. A strange emptiness settled in her chest as she turned back toward the main house, the 3 weeks suddenly stretching before her like an eternity. He'll be back before you know it, Rebecca said gently, appearing at Catherine's side. She'd delayed her return to Denver specifically to keep Catherine company during Jackson's absence, a kindness Catherine suspected had been orchestrated by Margaret Blackwood's perceptive understanding. Is it that obvious? Catherine asked, embarrassed by her transparency. Rebecca laughed. Only to everyone with eyes. You two circle each other like planets caught in each other's gravity. The days without Jackson fell into a rhythm of their own. Catherine's responsibilities in the household gradually increased as she proved her capabilities, moving beyond simple tasks to managing household accounts and helping Margaret plan for the upcoming summer social events. The physical marks of her father's abuse faded, though sometimes she still woke gasping from nightmares that left her sheets tangled and damp with sweat. On those nights, she would sit by her window, watching the stars and thinking of Jackson somewhere under the same sky, perhaps keeping watch over sleeping cattle. The letter he had entrusted to one of the ranch hands before departing rested in her bedside drawer, its contents committed to memory after countless readings. Catherine, Words have never come easily to me, but there are things that need saying between us. When I return from the drive, I hope we might speak plainly about the future. Know that you are never far from my thoughts, even as duty takes me from your side. Yours, Jackson. Brief and restrained, yet the possessive yours at the end had sent her heart racing every time she read it. Rebecca teased her gently about the lovesick sighs that occasionally escaped when Catherine thought no one was listening, but there was no malice in it, only the warm camaraderie of women sharing confidences. 2 weeks into Jackson's absence, Catherine was returning from a trip to town with Margaret when they spotted an unfamiliar buggy outside the house. As they drew closer, Catherine's blood ran cold. Her father sat on the front porch talking with Sean Blackwood, both men's postures rigid with barely contained tension. "Stay in the wagon," Margaret instructed firmly, but Catherine was already climbing down, her legs unsteady but determined. "What is he doing here?" she asked as she approached, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. Both men turned. Sean's expression was guarded, while her father, sober and cleanly shaven for the first time in months, stood awkwardly clutching his hat in his hands. "Catherine," Thomas Miller acknowledged, his eyes taking in the changes in his daughter. The haunted pallor had faded from her cheeks, replaced by the healthy glow of someone who slept soundly and ate regular meals. Her posture was different too, straighter, no longer curled protectively as though expecting a blow. "You shouldn't be here," she said, stopping a safe distance away. "The restraining order—" "I spoke with Sheriff Barnes first," Thomas interrupted. "Got his permission to come, provided Mr. Blackwood agreed." He glanced at Sean, who nodded confirmation. "What do you want?" Catherine asked, aware of Margaret coming to stand supportively beside her. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I've come to give you these." He indicated a small trunk in his buggy. "Your mother's things. Thought you might want them." The unexpected gesture caught Catherine off guard. "Why now?" "That cowboy of yours came to see me," Thomas said, something like reluctant respect in his tone. "Made me realize some things about you, about what I've done." Catherine felt Margaret's hand come to rest gently on her shoulder, a silent reminder of her support. "You can't undo the past with a trunk of mementos." "I know that," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion she'd rarely heard from him. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, girl. Just wanted you to have what's rightfully yours." Catherine studied her father closely. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His clothes were clean, his face freshly shaved, his eyes clearer than she'd seen them in years. Something had shifted in him, though whether it would last remained uncertain. "I've taken the job at the Simmons farm," he continued when she remained silent. "Staying in their old bunkhouse. Haven't touched a drop in 10 days. 10 days isn't very long," Catherine observed, though something inside her ached at this glimpse of the man her father might have been without whiskey's influence. "It's a start," Thomas acknowledged. "Longest I've been sober since your mother died." The mention of her mother hung between them, laden with shared grief and divergent responses to it, his descent into alcoholism and abuse, her endurance and eventual escape. "Wade said you might come back to the farm someday," Thomas continued awkwardly. "Not to live, just to visit. Said maybe we could find some way to—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the fragile possibility of reconciliation. "I don't know if that's possible," Catherine said honestly. "Some wounds don't heal completely." Thomas nodded, accepting her words without the anger that would have erupted in the past. "The trunk's yours regardless. I'll leave it and be on my way." Sean Blackwood, who had observed the exchange silently, finally spoke. "I'll have one of the hands help you with the trunk, Miller. No need to strain yourself." As Thomas turned to go, Catherine found herself taking a single step forward. "Father." He paused, hope flashing briefly across his weathered face. "I'm glad you're getting help," she said, the words difficult but sincere. Mother would be glad too. Something broke in Thomas Miller's expression. Not anger, but a deep and painful recognition of all he had lost, all he had destroyed. He nodded once, unable to speak, then climbed stiffly into his buggy. That evening, Catherine sat alone in her room, the trunk open before her. Inside were treasures she had thought lost forever. Her mother's wedding quilt, carefully folded, a journal filled with her elegant handwriting, a cameo brooch Catherine remembered her wearing to church, photographs and letters and small mementos of a happier time. Among them was a small leather-bound Bible with her mother's name inscribed inside. As Catherine turned the yellowed pages, a pressed wildflower fell into her lap, a prairie rose, her mother's favorite. The sight of it unleashed tears. Catherine hadn't realized she was still holding back, grief and healing mingling as they flowed down her cheeks. When Rebecca found her later, Catherine was sitting by the window, her mother's shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a peaceful expression having replaced her tears. "Are you all right?" Rebecca asked gently. "I think I am," Catherine replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "For the first time in years, I think I might be." That night, she slept without nightmares, her mother's Bible on the nightstand beside Jackson's letter, twin anchors of a past reconciled and a future full of promise. 3 weeks stretched to nearly 4 before the first riders from the cattle drive were spotted on the horizon. Catherine, who had taken to spending her free afternoons on the front porch with her mending or a book, was first to see them. Her heart leapt at the distant dust cloud, hands suddenly unsteady as she set aside her sewing. "They're back," she called into the house, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. Margaret emerged, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Thank heavens, Sean's been worried about the delay." Catherine didn't need to ask if Jackson was among the returning men. Something inside her, something that had awakened during their brief time together and grown stronger in his absence, told her he was there, coming back to her as promised. The men rode in tired but triumphant, their faces weathered by weeks on the trail but spirits high from a successful drive. Sean greeted them in the yard, clapping shoulders and receiving preliminary reports as the hands dismounted and led weary horses toward the barn. Catherine remained on the porch, suddenly shy despite her eagerness. When Jackson finally appeared at the rear of the group, leading his mount slowly, her breath caught in her throat. He looked leaner, his skin bronzed darker by sun and wind, a new scar visible along his jawline that hadn't been there before. His eyes found hers immediately, as though drawn by some invisible force. The connection between them, stretched thin by distance, snapped back into place with an almost physical impact. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the yard, the bustle of activity fading around them. Then Sean called Jackson's name, breaking the spell. Catherine watched as he reluctantly turned away to report to his employer, his gaze finding hers once more before he followed Sean toward the barn. Dinner that evening was a celebratory affair. The successful drive had brought excellent prices at the railhead, securing the ranch's prosperity for another season. The hands were invited to join the family at extended tables set up on the lawn, lanterns hanging from tree branches casting a golden glow over the gathering as twilight deepened. Catherine, seated between Rebecca and Margaret at the main table, found her attention continually drawn to Jackson at the Cowboy's table. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the space, a silent communication that made her cheeks warm despite the evening's cooling air. "You should take some coffee to the men," Margaret suggested with knowing gentleness after the meal concluded. "I'm sure they've missed a proper brew after weeks of trail coffee." Grateful for the pretext, Catherine helped prepare a tray. As she approached the Cowboy's table, conversations quieted, the men nodding respectfully. Jackson stood as she neared, the gesture drawing curious glances from his companions. "Miss Miller." He greeted her formally, though his eyes spoke volumes more. "I thought you might appreciate some coffee," she said, setting down the tray. "Mrs. Blackwood's special blend. Thank you kindly." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Might I escort you back to the house after I've had my cup? The evening's getting dark." Catherine nodded, moving away to help Margaret and Rebecca clear the tables while Jackson finished his coffee. When he appeared at her side some minutes later, Margaret smoothly intervened before Catherine could speak. "Catherine, why don't you show Mr. Wade the new roses in the garden? They've just begun blooming while you men were away." The garden path was illuminated only by moonlight and the distant glow of lanterns, offering a privacy that would have been impossible in daylight. They walked in silence at first, the distance between them both intimate and proper, until they reached a small bench beneath a flowering apple tree. "You were gone longer than expected," Catherine said as they sat, careful to maintain a respectable space between them, despite her desire to be closer. "Storm delayed us in the foothills," Jackson explained. "Lost 2 men crossing a river that had swollen past its banks. Nearly lost more." Catherine's eyes went to the new scar along his jaw. "You were hurt." His hand rose self-consciously to the mark. "It's nothing. Branch caught me during the crossing." "It could have been worse," she said softly, the fear she'd held at bay during his absence suddenly surfacing. "You could have been, but I wasn't," he interrupted gently. "I came back, to the ranch, to you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Catherine found herself looking down at her hands, twisting nervously in her lap. "I received your letter," she said. "You mentioned speaking plainly about the future when you returned." Jackson shifted on the bench, turning to face her more fully. "I've never been good with words, Catherine. Actions have always come easier to me." "Then show me," she whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. In the silver moonlight, his eyes darkened. With deliberate slowness, he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers with gentle strength. "I've thought about this moment every night on the trail," he admitted. "What I would say to you, how I would say it." "And what did you decide?" Instead of answering immediately, Jackson reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the moonlight. A simple silver ring, fashioned in the shape of a knotted rope. "I had this made in Cheyenne," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "It's not fancy like what a proper lady might expect, but—" "It's beautiful," Catherine breathed, understanding blooming in her chest like the roses they'd used as an excuse to come here. "I know it's fast," Jackson continued, uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time since she'd known him. "We've barely had time together. But sometimes life shows you what matters in an instant, and everything that follows is just confirming what you already knew." He took a deep breath. "I don't have much to offer. The Blackwoods pay me well, and I've saved nearly everything through the years. I've got land staked out north of here, good land with water rights and timber. It would be a hard life at first, building something from nothing. But it would be ours, Catherine. Something we created together." The ring glinted between them, a simple circle that represented everything her heart had begun to yearn for, not just safety, but partnership, respect, and love, freely given and received. "Jackson Wade," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he confirmed, his gaze never leaving hers. "Not because you need saving, you've proven you can stand on your own, but because I believe we could build something beautiful together." The world seemed to hold its breath as Catherine looked from the silver ring to Jackson's face, moonlight silvering his features into something almost dreamlike. In the distance, laughter from the celebration drifted through the evening air, but here in their secluded corner of the garden, time had slowed to the rhythm of two hearts beating in anticipation. "Yes," Catherine whispered, her voice gaining strength as certainty filled her. "Yes, Jackson, I will marry you." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie, powerful and life-giving. With hands that had broken her father's belt, but now trembled slightly, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the silver rope knot symbolizing a bond that couldn't be broken. "I was so afraid you'd think it was too soon," he admitted, bringing her hand to his lips. "That I was rushing you after everything you've been through." Catherine shook her head. "Time moves differently out here. My mother used to say the frontier strips away pretense and shows what's truly in people's hearts." She looked down at the ring gleaming on her finger. "I've seen your heart, Jackson Wade. I've seen it in every action since the day you stood between me and my father's rage." He drew her closer on the bench, propriety momentarily set aside as his arm encircled her shoulders. "When should we tell the Blackwoods?" "Tonight," Catherine said decisively. "They've been like family to me. They deserve to know first." The news was received with delighted approval when they returned to the house. Margaret embraced Catherine warmly while Sean clapped Jackson on the shoulder with fatherly pride. "We'll need to plan the wedding," Margaret declared, already mentally arranging details. "Perhaps in the fall, when the weather turns cooler." "Sooner," Jackson said, his hand finding Catherine's again. "If Catherine agrees. I'd like to start building our home before winter comes." The next weeks passed in a flurry of preparations. News of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Most received it with approval. The Blackwood foreman and the school teacher who had escaped her father's cruelty seemed a fitting match to romantic hearts. Not all reactions were positive. Jackson encountered Thomas Miller in town one afternoon, the older man watching from outside the general store as Jackson selected lumber for the cabin he'd begun building on his land. "Heard you're marrying my daughter," Thomas said, falling into step beside Jackson as he loaded his wagon. "That's right." Jackson continued his work, alert but not hostile. Thomas was silent for a moment, his sobriety still a new and fragile thing. "She could do worse, I suppose," he finally offered, the closest thing to approval his pride would allow. Jackson straightened, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "I'll never hurt her. That's a promise." "See that you don't." There was a flash of the old Thomas in the warning, but something new as well, a father's concern, however awkwardly expressed, rather than a tyrant's demand. After a moment's hesitation, Jackson made a decision. "We're getting married next month. Small ceremony at the Blackwood Ranch." Thomas nodded, understanding the unspoken question. "I won't come if she doesn't want me there, but if she does..." He trailed off, the possibility hanging between them. "I'll have her write to you," Jackson said, neither encouraging nor discouraging the tentative olive branch. Catherine would make her own choice about her father's place in her new life. The letter Catherine eventually sent was brief but kind, inviting her father to attend the ceremony but not to give her away. That honor would go to Sean Blackwood, who had been more of a father to her in months than Thomas had been in years. It was a compromise that acknowledged both truth and the possibility of healing. On a clear June morning, with wildflowers carpeting the hills surrounding the Blackwood Ranch, Catherine stood before a small gathering of friends and neighbors. Her dress, sewn by her own hands with Margaret and Rebecca's help, was simple but elegant, adorned with lace from Rebecca's own wedding gown. She carried her mother's Bible and wore the cameo brooch that had been among the treasures in the trunk her father had brought. As she walked toward Jackson, who waited beside the ranch's rose arbor with the minister, Catherine felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. Sean Blackwood escorted her with dignified pride, and in the front row, Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as Rebecca beamed beside her. On the far edge of the gathering stood Thomas Miller, sober and uncomfortable in his Sunday best but present, a ghost from her past witnessing her step into a future of her own choosing. The vows they spoke were traditional but infused with personal meaning. When Jackson promised to cherish and protect her, Catherine knew it came from a place of respect for her strength, not assumption of her weakness. And when she pledged herself to him, it was with the freedom of a woman who chose her path rather than one who sought escape. The celebration afterward was joyful but brief. By mid-afternoon, Jackson was helping Catherine into the wagon that would take them to their new home, a small cabin on the edge of a meadow beside a clear-running creek. It wasn't finished yet, but it had a solid roof, tight walls, and windows that caught the light from both sunrise and sunset. As they crested the final hill and their homestead came into view, Jackson drew the horses to a stop. "It's not much to look at yet," he said, uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time that day. Catherine took in the cabin nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains, the fresh-cut lumber gleaming golden in the afternoon sun. A garden plot had been turned over beside it, waiting for seeds. Beyond stretched grassland, perfect for the small herd of cattle that would form the heart of their ranch. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it with all her heart. "It's ours." Jackson's arm tightened around her waist. "We'll build something good here, something lasting." As they continued down the hill toward their new home, Catherine thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a frightened young woman trapped in her father's house to a bride beginning a life of her own choosing. The marks of her past would always be part of her story, but they no longer defined her future. The moment Jackson lifted her from the wagon and carried her across the threshold of their cabin, she knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found not just safety, but something far more precious, a love built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the kind of strength that comes from having faced darkness and chosen light instead. Outside their window, the prairie stretched endless and promising beneath the vast Wyoming sky, a fitting backdrop for the life they would build together, one day at a time.